Hey, what's up, stringlings? Today I want to talk a little bit about music theory. We're going to talk something about some of the terms that we use to describe styles of music. And in particular, we're going to look at classical versus classical versus classical. Stay tuned. Okay, often when we talk about musical genres, we talk about them in terms of big blanket styles, right? Rock, pop, classical, country, what else is there? New age, right? And these are really big blanket terms. What does rock include? What's included in rock music? There's rock, there's classic rock, there's indie rock, there's metal. And in metal, you've got heavy metal, speed metal, black metal, deathcore, grindcore. It's just everywhere, right? So we have the same problem with classical music. So classical has a bunch of different meanings to it. So we need to be very careful with which one we use and when we're going to use it. So let's start with the very basic definition of classical. Classical 1. Classical, in a broad cultural sense, generally refers to the period of time from ancient Greece and Rome. That's the classical period in Western history. Now, as it happens, we can apply that term broadly to other cultures. So there is classical Indian culture, for example. There's classical Chinese culture. And what it is kind of a flowering point of intellectual and scientific study within that culture. So when we look at the classical period, we think about, the classical era, we think about great philosophers. We think about empire building. We think about the birth of democracy. We think about science. We think about mathematics. These are things that came out of the classical era. So in general, these are things that happen at sort of the pinnacle of a society just before things get really weird in the medieval era. And there is medieval China, there is medieval Japan, right? Just like there's medieval Europe. And that has to do with some very specific terminology that we'll get into when we deal with what we call the Middle Ages in Western civilization. So in Western civilization, classical refers to Greece and Rome specifically. Classical 2. Classical 2 is a period of music that in the Western tradition stems from around 1700 to, let's say, 1850. These are, or maybe like 1820. So these are really kind of arbitrary dates. There's nothing specific about 1700 that everybody went, now we're classical. Now it's classical music. Before it was something else, but now it's classical. That didn't happen, right? And keep in mind that just like every other period in history and every other type of periodization, which is where we break history into chunks, the people that were alive and doing the thing at the time are not the ones who called it the classical period. Okay? They didn't call it that. Now, what's interesting is we look at this as the period of music known as the classical period. And it corresponds to an influence from what was called neoclassical architecture and philosophy and art. Okay. Neo is a prefix that means new or a revival. So neoclassical architecture was at the time around 1700-ish, a little bit earlier, when you start seeing architecture with columns, just like you saw in ancient Greece. You see architecture with white marble and columns and lots of symmetry. Picture the White House or the Capitol building, if you need a frame of reference. These are essentially neoclassical structures with some, American tweaks, but neoclassical nonetheless. And these stem from that same time period. Remember, right? When was the American Revolution? 1776. Bam, right in the middle of this time period. Okay. what makes the classical period in music classical is it has an element of symmetry to the form. It's very refined, it's very structured, and it's very clean. I like to use this example, right? Let's take a look at two characters from Pirates of the Caribbean. So compare this wig to this wig. Do you see the difference? One is very curly, one is very tight. These are two different generations of men at around the early 1700s when this was going on. Now compare these two wigs. This is Bach and this is Mozart. Get the idea? Compare these two scores. This is Bach and this is Mozart. Okay? These two guys lived at the same time-ish. Okay? Bach died in 1750, right? So there's a little bit of crossover between their time periods, just like there's a little bit of crossover between the stuff your mom and dad listened to and the stuff you listen to now, right? So musicians don't just go, from this point, music is classical. No, there's always transitional periods. But the classical era is marked by this this refinement, this cleanliness of sound. We want a clearly defined melody with a clearly defined accompaniment. Sometimes we have some counterpoint, but things have to come back to this identifiable sound. So this is the era of Mozart and Haydn, okay, as your most popular contributors. Beethoven started here, but then he just kind of went full Beethoven and started a new thing. That's another video for another time. Then we come to the classical genre. Okay, so when we talk about classical music, I might talk about a classical composer being Mozart or Salieri or Haydn or Clementi. But when we talk about classical music is distinct from, let's say, popular music or rock music, right? It's a genre all on its own. Classical music is comprised of a bunch of style periods: Renaissance, Baroque, classical, Romantic, 20th century, what they call modern music, which happened 100 years ago, postmodern music, and all this kind of stuff. So really the key difference is this. When we refer to classical something, right, we're, other than an era in history, right, we're talking about an established artistic standard. Okay? And I know we take a lot of flack nowadays in the Western tradition for assuming that ours is the established artistic tradition. I like using the term Western classical music, okay? Because any way you slice it, Europe had an insular artistic development that stretched for 3,000 years. Okay, so we can talk about classical Chinese music, we can talk about classical Indian music, and we can talk about classical Western music. And they're different things, and they're different traditions, but they're all classical within the framework of their given societies, within the framework of their cultural evolution. So we have this art music tradition that really comes from when art music started getting codified, that is, written down and people talking about it in the Middle Ages. Okay, there's not really a jumping off point, but sometime around 600-ish is a good kind of starting point. Origins of Gregorian chant, the quadrivium, that kind of thing. Through the development of actually writing music all the way through the Renaissance, and then deciding, is music a human thing or is it a divine thing? All of that. This tradition goes all the way back to about 500 CE. So good 1,500 years ago. Okay, that's plenty long enough to call it a classical tradition. And so because of this, you can have kind of the high point of your artistic culture being that thing. Yes, it's elitist, because it was generally people with money who were paying for these things. That's just how it works in societies that have structure. So you can have classical ballet, you can have classical drama, right? You can have classical music. Basically anything older than the Renaissance we typically call ancient music as opposed to classical music. So historians get a little bit fudgy with the details. just depending on how they want to name things. The excuse me, just pull up make sure my recording is still going here. All right. So what this means, right, is that you can go to any online index. If this was 10 years ago, I could see you could walk into any record store. I don't think record stores exist anywhere anymore, other than independent shops. And there's a classical section, right? But you won't go into a record store and find a Renaissance section or a Big C classical 18th century section. Classical is everything, so you'll find Rachmaninoff and Mozart and Tallis all kind of lumped together, even though there is more time between Rachmaninoff and Mozart than there is between Mozart and Beethoven, or than there is between Rachmaninoff and the Beatles, right? So the Beatles are not in this spectrum of classical music. So speaking of, no, today's popular music isn't going to be classical in 200 years. And there's a very good reason for that. I'll do another video on this. But what I'm trying to get across here is that there are, when we talk about music, when we talk about classical music, there are really two distinctions that we really need to pay attention to. So one is the classical period, 1700s into the early 1800s. And then there's classical music, the broad spectrum of what we would call Western art music. That's the thing that I want you to take away, right? So when we talk about, in the upcoming video, when we talk about the difference between neoclassical music, we'll know exactly what we're talking about, you know, more or less on a timeline. So that's kind of classical in a nutshell, those three different definitions, okay? And if you enjoyed this, please give it a thumbs up, give me a comment in the comment section, and if you feel like making a little contribution to keep these videos coming, please stop by my Patreon, and I would very much appreciate that. Thanks very much, and we will talk again very soon.